The 911 call crackled through the dispatch radio on that humid Tuesday morning in Lake Harmony, Pennsylvania. "There's a trespasser in our lake office." The woman's voice trembled with manufactured urgency. "He's refusing to leave private HOA property. Send someone immediately." But when Sheriff Deputy Marcus Rodriguez arrived at the floating office on Crystal Lake, the words that would leave the caller frozen in humiliation were already forming on his lips. "Ma'am, he owns it." David Chen had always been a quiet man who preferred the gentle lapping of lake water to the chaos of suburban politics. At 52, the software engineer had spent his entire adult life building a modest fortune through careful investment, peace, and frugal living. When he inherited his grandfather's waterfront property on Crystal Lake in 2019, David thought he'd found his slice of paradise, or place where he could work remotely, tend to his small dog, and enjoy the peace his grandfather had always promised him. What David didn't anticipate was Margaret Whitmore. Margaret, 64, had moved to the Pine Valley Estates development adjacent to Crystal Lake 3 years prior, immediately inserting herself into every committee, board, and neighborhood association within a 5-mile radius. With her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer pantsuits that seemed absurdly formal for lakeside living, Margaret had one mission: control. As the self-appointed president of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association, she ruled with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive pleasantries. The trouble began in March 2023, when Margaret noticed David using what she considered her lake office. The floating structure had been a fixture on Crystal Lake for over 30 years, a charming blue and white building that served as both a small office and storage facility for lake maintenance equipment. Most residents assumed it belonged to the HOA, which had been collecting annual fees for lake maintenance and facility upkeep since the development was built. Margaret had been using it as her personal headquarters for HOA meetings, her private retreat for morning coffee, and occasionally, as neighbors whispered, for entertaining gentlemen callers. When her husband was traveling for business, David's first encounter with Margaret's territorial nature came on a peaceful Sunday morning in early spring. He had rowed his small kayak to the floating office, intending to do some quiet programming work while enjoying the lake view. His grandfather had always told him stories about using the old office, but David had never paid much attention to the legal details until Margaret came storming across the lake in her pontoon boatlick. A suburban naval commander, excuse me." Margaret's voice carried across the water with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "That's private HOA property. You'll need to leave immediately." David looked up from his laptop, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My grandfather built this office. It's part of our family property." Margaret's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Your grandfather may have built it, but it's been HOA property for decades. Check your deed restrictions, Mr. Chen. This lake office has been maintained by association fees for years." The confrontation might have ended there, with David retreating to avoid conflict, but something in Margaret's tone, the casual assumption that he would simply comply without question, sparked a determination he didn't know he possessed. "I'll look into it," David said calmly, though his hands had begun to shake slightly. But until I see documentation proving otherwise, I believe I have every right to be here." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." Over the following weeks, Margaret launched what could only be described as a campaign of harassment. She organized emergency HOA meetings to discuss the trespassing issue. She sent certified letters demanding David cease his illegal occupation of association property. She even convinced several neighbors to sign a petition calling for his immediate removal from the lake office. But David had begun his own investigation. Late nights found him hunched over property records, deed documents, and faded blueprints his grandfather had kept in an old filing cabinet. What he discovered made his blood run cold and his resolve stronger than ever. The lake office wasn't just built by his grandfather. It was specifically excluded from any HOA agreements in the original property development. More shocking still, David found evidence that Margaret had been aware of this fact from the beginning. A folder marked Lake Office legal issues contained correspondence between Margaret and a local attorney, clearly outlining David's legitimate ownership claim. Margaret had been lying. Not just lying, she had been collecting money from neighbors for maintaining a facility she knew she had no legal right to control. On the morning of June 15, 2023, David made a decision that would change everything. He loaded his kayak with a folding desk, his laptop, and a thermos of coffee, and paddled out to what was rightfully his lake office. He had every intention of working peacefully, reviewing code for a client project while enjoying the gentle morning breeze. Margaret spotted him within minutes. The 911 call came at 9:47 a.m. Emergency dispatch. "What's your emergency?" "Yes, this is Margaret Whitmore, president of the Crystal Lake HOA. We have a trespasser who's refused multiple requests to leave our private property. He's in our lake office and won't budge. I need law enforcement here immediately, sir." "Can you describe the nature of the threat?" He's not being violent, but he's trespassing and it's causing distress to the community. Just send someone, please." Deputy Rodriguez arrived 23 minutes later, his patrol boat cutting through the calm morning water toward the floating office where David sat peacefully typing on his laptop. Margaret stood on her dock, pointing dramatically toward the structure, surrounded by 3 other neighbors who had gathered to witness what she had promised would be David's final humiliation. The deputy's radio crackled as he approached. "Dispatch, I'm on scene at Crystal Lake. Can you give me the complainant's exact location?" Margaret waved frantically from her dock. "Officer, over here. That's our trespasser in the blue building." Deputy Rodriguez tied his boat to the office dock and climbed aboard. David looked up with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Good morning, officer. I'm David Chen. I assume you're here about Mrs. Whitmore's complaint." "That's right, sir. She says you're trespassing on her property. I need to see some identification and get your side of the story." David handed over his driver's license and a manila folder thick with documents. "Officer, I understand Mrs. Whitmore's confusion, but this is actually my property. My grandfather built this office in 1991. And it's specifically excluded from any HOA jurisdiction. I have all the documentation right here." Deputy Rodriguez spent several minutes reviewing the documents while Margaret paced on her dock, her confidence visibly wavering as the conversation continued longer than she had anticipated. Finally, the deputy looked up. His voice carried clearly across the still water as he called to Margaret, "Ma'am, could you join us over here, please?" Margaret climbed aboard her pontoon boat with 3 neighbors in tow, their small flotilla approaching the lake office like an amateur or mutter. The deputy waited until they were close enough to hear clearly before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed Mr. Chen's documentation, and I need to inform you that this office is indeed his private property. According to these deed records and the original development plans, the structure was specifically excluded from HOA control." The color drained from Margaret's face. That's impossible. "We've been maintaining this property for years. We collect fees specifically for—" "Ma'am," Deputy Rodriguez interrupted gently but firmly, "he owns it." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the boats and the distant call of a loon. Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The neighbors who had come to witness David's removal instead found themselves witnessing Margaret's public humiliation. But David's victory would prove to be only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous battle that, as Deputy Rodriguez prepared to leave, Margaret found her voice one final time. "This isn't over, Mr. Chen. Not by a long shot." The threat in her words was unmistakable, and David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze off the lake. He had won this confrontation, but he was beginning to realize that Margaret Whitmore was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully within hours. David would discover just how far Margaret was willing to go to maintain her grip on power and how a simple property dispute was about to explode into a legal war that would expose corruption, fraud, and betrayal that went far deeper than anyone in Pine Valley Estates could have imagined. The anonymous note appeared under David's door at 6 a.m. the morning after the lake confrontation, written in block letters that screamed barely contained fury. "You think you've won. You have no idea what you've started. Leave now or face the consequences." David's hands trembled as he read the words by his kitchen window, watching the sun rise over Crystal Lake. The peaceful water that had once brought him solace now felt like a barrier between him and a growing storm he couldn't yet fully comprehend. His phone had been ringing constantly since Deputy Rodriguez left the day before, some calls from curious neighbors, others from unknown numbers that went silent when he answered. But the note was just the beginning. By noon, David discovered that someone had called his employer's HR department, claiming he was using company equipment to run an illegal business from a disputed property. The complaint was anonymous, but the detailed knowledge of his work schedule and client relationships made the source obvious. His boss, thankfully, knew David well enough to dismiss the complaint, but the message was clear. Margaret was willing to attack every aspect of his life. The campaign of harassment escalated with methodical precision. Margaret filed formal complaints with the county assessor's office, claiming David was operating a commercial enterprise without proper permits. She contacted the Department of Environmental Protection, alleging he was polluting the lake with unauthorized sewage disposal from the office. Each complaint was baseless, but each required David to take time off work, hire lawyers, and fight battles he never should have had to fight. The emotional toll was devastating. David had always been a private person, content with his small circle of friends and his quiet life. Now he found himself thrust into a spotlight he never wanted, defending his integrity against accusations that seemed to multiply daily. Sleep became elusive as anxiety gnawed at him through the long nights, and his usually steady hands shook as he tried to focus on his programming work. It was during one of these sleepless nights, 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, that David decided to fight back. He contacted Sarah Martinez, a property law attorney recommended by his grandfather's old lawyer. Sarah was in her early 40s, with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen too many cases where powerful people tried to intimidate those with fewer resources. When David finished explaining his situation, her expression was grim. "Mr. Chen, what you're describing sounds like intentional harassment designed to force you to abandon a legitimate property claim. That's not just unethical, it could be criminal. What can we do about it?" "We're going to do what bullies never expect," Sarah said, leaning forward with a determined smile. "We're going to dig deeper." Sarah's investigation began with a forensic examination of HOA financial records. What she discovered was staggering. For over 5 years, Margaret had been collecting lake maintenance fees from residents approximately $400 per household annually, ostensibly for upkeep of the lake office and surrounding facilities. The total amount collected exceeded $180,000. But the maintenance receipts told a different story. Actual lake maintenance had cost less than $15,000 over the same period. The remaining funds have been funneled through a complex web of shell companies, all ultimately controlled by Margaret and her husband, Robert Whitmore. She's been running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, Sarah explained to David during a tense meeting in her office. The lake office was just one piece of a much larger fraud. She needed to maintain the fiction that the HOA controlled valuable properties to justify the fees she was collecting. David felt sick. So this was never really about the office. The office was the keystone holding up her entire criminal enterprise. When you prove ownership, you threaten to expose everything. Sarah's investigation revealed additional disturbing facts. Margaret had used HOA funds to pay for personal vacations, home renovations, and even her daughter's college tuition. She had created fake vendor invoices, phantom maintenance contracts, and fictitious emergency repairs to justify the massive expenditures. But the most shocking discovery came when Sarah hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance round the lake properties. Jake Morrison was a former police detective turned private investigator with 23 years of experience in covering fraud and corruption. His initial assignment was simple: document any additional harassment directed at David and gather evidence of Margaret's misuse of HOA property. What he captured on camera was far more damaging than anyone expected. The surveillance footage from June 28 showed Margaret entering the lake office at 7 p.m., carrying what appeared to be important documents and a laptop computer. For nearly 2 hours, she methodically went through filing cabinets and storage areas, removing materials and loading them into several cardboard boxes. But it was the audio that proved most damning. Jake had installed high-tech recording equipment near the office, and the conversation he captured would become the cornerstone of the legal case that followed. "Did you get everything from the office?" Robert Whitmore's voice was clearly audible as he helped Margaret load boxes into their boat. Most of it, the original maintenance contracts, the vendor invoices, all the financial records. Without these, they can't prove how much money we actually collected. "What about the Chen problem?" Margaret's laugh was cold and calculating. "Oh, I have plans for Mr. Chen. By the time I'm finished with him, he'll be begging to sign the office over to the HOA. Sometimes you have to destroy someone's life to save your own." "Are you sure this is the right approach, Margaret? If he finds out about the missing money, he won't, and if he does, it'll be his word against mine. Who do you think the neighbors will believe? The respected HOA president who's been serving this community for years? Or some antisocial computer nerd who probably doesn't even pay his taxes properly?" The recording continued for several more minutes, with Margaret outlining a detailed plan to plant evidence in David's home office that would suggest tax evasion, to spread rumors about his mental stability, and to use her connections in local government to make his life a living hell until he abandoned his property claim. When Sarah played the recording for David in her office, the color drained from his face. "She's trying to destroy my entire life over a property dispute. This stopped being about property the moment you threatened her financial scheme," Sarah replied grimly. "She's committed multiple felonies, and she knows it. From her perspective, discrediting you isn't just about winning, it's about staying out of prison." But Margaret had made a crucial mistake in her desperation to cover up years of embezzlement. She had escalated from civil harassment to criminal conspiracy. The recorded conversation provided evidence of intent to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to file false charges. Sarah immediately contacted the district attorney's office. Within days, Detective Amanda Foster from the Financial Crimes Unit had opened a formal investigation into the Crystal Lake HOA's finances. The investigation moved with surprising speed. Detective Foster, a 15-year veteran of white-collar crime investigations, recognized the patterns immediately. "This is textbook embezzlement with a harassment component," she explained to David and Sarah during a meeting at the prosecutor's office. "We see this more often than you'd think. People in positions of community trust who start small and escalate when they think they can get away with it." By mid-July, the investigation had uncovered additional evidence that made Margaret's situation even more desperate. Bank records showed that she had been systematically transferring HOA funds to personal accounts. For over 3 years, the total amount embezzled exceeded $200,000 when all shell companies and hidden transactions were factored in. But Margaret wasn't finished fighting. On July 18th, David received a call from Detective Foster that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Chen, I need to inform you that Mrs. Whitmore has filed formal charges against you with our office. She's claiming that you've been harassing her, threatening her safety, and attempting to extort money from the HOA by making false property claims David's had spun. That's completely false. I have witnesses. Documentation. I know, and we know. But she's filed sworn affidavits with the court, and there's going to be a hearing. She's also obtained a temporary restraining order that prohibits you from coming within 500 feet of her property or the lake office. The restraining order was Margaret's final, desperate gambit. By portraying herself as the victim of David's alleged harassment, she hoped to shift public sympathy and create reasonable doubt about the financial crimes she was accused of committing. The strategy was more sophisticated than David had expected. Margaret had convinced 3 neighbors to sign affidavits claiming they had witnessed David making threatening gestures and using intimidating language during encounters around the lake. She had compiled a detailed log of dates and times when David had allegedly engaged in stalking behavior near her property. Most damaging of all, she had obtained security camera footage that appeared to show David lurking near her dock late at night, behavior she characterized as clearly threatening and designed to intimidate a vulnerable woman living alone while her husband travels for business. When David viewed the footage with Sarah, his heart sank. The video clearly showed a figure near Margaret's dock at 11 p.m. on several occasions, and while the image quality was poor, the person appeared to be roughly David's height and build. "This is impossible," David said, his voice barely above her whisper. "I've never been to her dock at night. I barely leave my house after dark." Sarah studied the footage carefully. The timestamp shows these incidents occur on July 2nd, 8th, and 15th. "Do you have any way to prove where you were on those nights?" David's mind raced. July 2nd had been a Tuesday, he remembered, because he'd had a late conference call with a client in California. July 8th was when he'd driven to visit his sister in Philadelphia, staying overnight to help her with a home repair project. July 15th. Wait, David said suddenly. July 15th was the night of that terrible thunderstorm. The power went out around 9 p.m., and it didn't come back on until after midnight. I spent the whole evening reading by candlelight because I couldn't work on my computer. Sarah's eyes sharpened. "Can you prove that?" The power company logs would show the outage, and I posted photos on social media. I remember taking a picture of my living room lit by candles because it looked so unusual. As they investigated further, the doctored nature of Margaret's evidence became apparent. The security footage had been edited to remove timestamps showing the power outage, and the figure in the video appeared to be wearing a wig that roughly matched David's hair color and style. But perhaps most tellingly, Jake Morrison's surveillance equipment had been recording continuously during the periods when David was allegedly stalking Margaret. The footage clearly showed David at home during every incident Margaret had reported. "She's not just embezzling money," Sarah said grimly. "She's manufacturing evidence to support false criminal charges. That's a felony in itself." The revelation that Margaret was willing to fabricate evidence and file false police reports mark a turning point in David's emotional journey. The quiet software engineer who had simply wanted to use his grandfather's lake office had been transformed by necessity into someone willing to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for all the neighbors who had been defrauded by Margaret's scheme. As the date for the restraining order hearing approached, David felt a mixture of terror and determination. He knew that Margaret had underestimated both his resolve and the strength of the evidence against her. But he also knew that the most dangerous moments in any legal battle come when a desperate opponent has nothing left to lose. The courtroom showdown that awaited would test everything David had learned about himself, about justice, and about the price of standing up to corruption in small-town America. The Lancaster County Courthouse buzzed with unusual energy on the morning of August 15, 2023. Word had spread throughout Pine Valley Estates about the restraining order hearing between Margaret Whitman and David Chen, and the courtroom gallery was packed with neighbors, local reporters, and curious onlookers who sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to investigator Jake Morrison, had been presiding over civil disputes for 12 years, but she had rarely seen a case file as thick as the one before her. What had begun as a simple property dispute had mushroomed into allegations of embezzlement, fraud, harassment, and fabricated evidence that read more like a crime novel than a typical restraining order proceeding. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, James Crawford, a local lawyer known for his aggressive tactics and expensive suits. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, her conservative navy blue dress with a pearl necklace, her silver hair styled in a way that emphasized her role as a respectable community leader under attack by an unstable neighbor. David sat across the aisle with Sarah Martinez, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he fought to control his nervous energy. The past month had been a whirlwind of depositions, document reviews, and sleepless nights as the legal machinery ground forward toward this moment. The gallery behind Margaret was filled with 3 neighbors who had signed her affidavits, along with several other residents who had been convinced by her version of events. Behind David sat his sister Jennifer, Jake Morrison, Detective Foster, and a handful of neighbors who had grown suspicious of Margaret's financial management over the years. Judge Morrison called the court to order at 9 a.m. sharp. This is a hearing on the petition for a permanent restraining order filed by Margaret Whitmore against David Chen. Mr. Crawford, you may present your case. Crawford rose with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating opponents through sheer force of personality. His opening statement painted David as an unstable individual whose obsession with the lake office had spiraled into a campaign of harassment and intimidation against a vulnerable woman. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore has served the Pine Valley Estates community with distinction for over 3 years. She has volunteered countless hours managing HOA affairs, organizing community events, and maintaining the properties that make Crystal Lake such a desirable place to live. Crawford gestured toward Margaret, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue in a performance worthy of community theater. But Mr. Chen's unfounded claims about the lake office have led to increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. Mrs. Whitmore has been forced to live in fear, never knowing when Mr. Chen might appear at her dock, lurking in the shadows, making threatening gestures, and creating an atmosphere of intimidation that no woman should have to endure. Crawford presented the security footage with dramatic flair, narrating each alleged incident while Margaret nodded solemnly, and the neighbors behind her murmured sympathetically, "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore simply wants to feel safe in her own home. She's not asking for money or seeking revenge. She just wants protection from a man whose behavior has become increasingly unstable and threatening." When Crawford finished, Judge Morrison turned to Sarah Martinez. "Ms. Martinez, your response." Sarah rose slowly, her expression grave. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of harassment, but rather an elaborate attempt to cover up years of systematic embezzlement and fraud. Mrs. Whitmore is not the victim in this courtroom. She is the perpetrator of crimes that have defrauded an entire community." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Sarah continued. "Over the past month, our investigation has uncovered evidence that Mrs. Whitmore has embezzled over $200,000 from the Crystal Lake HOA. When Mr. Chen's legitimate property claim threatened to expose her fraud, she escalated to criminal harassment, fabrication of evidence, and filing false police reports." Crawford shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These are wild accusations with no basis in fact. This hearing is about a restraining order, not unsubstantiated financial allegations." Judge Morrison raised her hand. "Mr. Crawford, please sit down." "Ms. Martinez, I'll allow you to present your evidence, but it had better be directly relevant to the restraining order petition." Sarah nodded. "Your Honor, it's absolutely relevant, because the alleged harassment is entirely fabricated. Mrs. Whitmore created false evidence to support this restraining order as part of her attempt to discredit Mr. Chen and prevent him from exposing her crimes." Sarah walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present surveillance footage taken by licensed private investigator Jake Morrison during the exact times when Ms. Whitmore claims Mr. Chen was stalking her property." The courtroom fell silent as Sarah played the footage on the court's video system. The timestamps were clearly visible, showing David at home during every alleged incident. Then she played the authentic security footage from Margaret's property, which revealed a figure that was clearly not David, someone taller and wearing an obvious wig. Margaret's face went pale as gasps echoed through the courtroom. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I'd also like to present audio recordings made by Mr. Morrison during his investigation." Sarah nodded to the bailiff, who activated the courtroom's audio system. Robert Whitmore's voice filled the courtroom. "Did you get everything from the office?" Margaret's response was crystal clear. "Most of it. The original maintenance contracts, the vendor invoices, all the financial records. Without these, they can't prove how much money we actually collected." The conversation continued, each word driving nails into Margaret's credibility. When her recorded voice outlined her plan to destroy David's life and plant evidence of tax evasion, several neighbors behind her stood up and walked out, their faces showing a mixture of shock and disgust. Margaret grabbed her attorney's arm, whispering frantically, but Crawford's face had gone ashen as he realized the scope of what his client had allegedly done. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess to review the evidence. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, her expression was grave. "Ms. Martinez, do you have additional evidence to present?" "Yes, Your Honor. Detective Amanda Faster from the Financial Crimes Unit is prepared to testify about the ongoing criminal investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's activities. Crawford leaped to his feet. Your Honor, I object. Detective Foster's testimony would be highly prejudicial and overruled, Judge Morrison said sharply. Given the serious nature of the allegations and the evidence presented, I'm going to hear what Detective Foster has to say. Detective Foster took the witness stand with the calm professionalism of someone who had testified in hundreds of cases. Her testimony was devastating, Your Honor. Our investigation has confirmed that Mrs. Whitmore systematically embezzled HOA funds over a 3-year period. We've traced over $200,000 in fraudulent transactions through multiple shell companies controlled by Mrs. Whitmore and her husband. Foster continued, detailing how Margaret had created fake vendor contracts, phantom maintenance expenses, and fictitious emergency repairs to justify the massive expenditures. Most significantly for this hearing, Your Honor, we've determined that Mrs. Whitmore's allegations against Mr. Chen are entirely fabricated. The surveillance footage she submitted as evidence was doctored, and her sworn affidavits contained demonstrably false statements. Crawford made a final, desperate attempt to salvage his client's case. Your Honor, even if there are questions about HOA finances, that doesn't justify Mr. Chen's alleged threatening behavior, Mr. Crawford, Judge Morrison interrupted. There was no threatening behavior. The evidence conclusively demonstrates that your client fabricated every allegation in her petition. The judge turned to address Margaret directly. Mrs. Whitmore, you have wasted this court's time with a petition based entirely on false evidence. You have filed sworn affidavits containing statements you knew to be untrue, and you have attempted to use the legal system to harass an innocent man in order to cover up your alleged crimes. Margaret's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. Your Honor, you don't understand. He was going to ruin everything. I worked so hard for this community. And he was going to destroy it all over some stupid building that nobody even cared about until he made it an issue. Crawford grabbed Margaret's arm, trying to stop her from speaking. But the words poured out in a flood of self-pity and justification. Do you know how much work it takes to manage an HOA? The thankless hours, the constant complaints, the impossible demands. I deserve compensation for my time. And if I had to be creative about how I got it, that was nobody's business but mine. The courtroom erupted as Margaret's confession echoed through the chamber. Judge Morrison banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the room finally quieted, Judge Morrison's voice was cold with controlled anger. Mrs. Whitmore, you have just confessed in open court to embezzling community funds. Mr. Crawford, I suggest you advise your client to exercise her Fifth Amendment rights immediately. But it was too late. Margaret's emotional breakdown had provided the final piece of evidence needed to complete the criminal case against her. Judge Morrison denied the restraining order petition and dismissed all charges against David. She also ordered Margaret to pay David's legal fees and issued a restraining order protecting David from any further harassment. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. As Margaret gathered her papers with shaking hands, preparing to leave the courtroom in disgrace, Detective Faster approached with 2 uniformed officers. "Margaret Whitmore, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, and perjury." The handcuffs clicked shut around Margaret's wrists as Crawford frantically tried to arrange bail. And the courtroom gallery buzzed with shocked conversation. David watched the arrest with a mixture of relief and sadness. He had won. But the victory felt hollow. An entire community had been betrayed by someone they had trusted, and the scars from Margaret's actions would take years to heal. As he walked out of the courthouse with Sarah, David thought he could finally put the nightmare behind him and return to his peaceful life at the lake. He had no idea that the biggest shock was still to come. 3 months after Margaret Whitmore's arrest, the Pine Valley Estates community was still reeling from the revelations that had emerged during the criminal trial. The local newspaper had covered every detail of the embezzlement scheme, and property values around Crystal Lake had actually increased as buyers were attracted to an HOA that was finally being run honestly and transparently. David had returned to his quiet life, working from the lake office that had started the entire ordeal. The floating building had been renovated with some of the recovered funds, and it now served as both his private workspace and a symbol of what one person could accomplish by refusing to be intimidated. On a crisp November morning, David was reviewing code for a client project when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Martinez's office number. "David, we need to talk. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There's been a development in the case that you need to know about." Sarah's tone was carefully neutral, but David detected an undercurrent of excitement that made him curious. The criminal case had been resolved months ago. Margaret had pled guilty to multiple felonies and was serving an 18-month sentence, while her husband Robert faced separate charges for his role in the conspiracy. When David arrived at Sarah's office, he found her sitting across from a man he didn't recognize, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. "David, I'd like you to meet Arthur Pemberton. He's a retired federal investigator, and he has some information about your case that's, well, it's extraordinary." Pemberton smiled and shook David's hand. "Mr. Chen, I've been following your situation with great interest. You see, Margaret Whitmore's activities around Crystal Lake were part of a much larger pattern that we've been investigating for several years." David settled into his chair, confused. "I'm not sure I understand. Margaret's in prison. The case is closed. The local case is closed." Pemberton agreed. But Margaret was working with a network of corrupt HOA officials across 3 states. She wasn't just embezzling from your community, she was part of a sophisticated criminal organization that has defrauded homeowners associations out of millions of dollars. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. "You're saying this wasn't just about our HOA?" "Not at all. Margaret was recruited into this network about 4 years ago by someone we've been trying to identify for a long time. Her methods were textbook: create fake maintenance contracts, establish shell companies, manufacture crises that require emergency assessments, and systematically drain community funds over several years." Sarah leaned forward. "Arthur contacted me because something Margaret said during her confession doesn't match the evidence we found. She claimed she deserved compensation for her work and had to be creative about getting it. But the financial analysis shows the embezzlement was far more sophisticated than someone acting alone could have managed. Pemberton nodded. We believe Margaret was following a detailed playbook provided by the network. More importantly, we think the real mastermind behind the operation has been using her case to gauge law enforcement response and adjust their methods accordingly. David's head was spinning. Are you saying Margaret was set up? Not exactly set up, but certainly manipulated. The person running this network recruits local HOA officials who show signs of financial desperation or control issues, provides them with the tools and methods to embezzle funds, and takes a percentage of the proceeds. When someone like Margaret gets caught, they're expendable. Sarah pulled out a thick file. Arthur showed me evidence that Margaret received detailed instructions about how to set up the shell companies, how to create fake vendor invoices, even how to handle resistance from property owners. She didn't develop these methods on her own. The question, Pemberton continued, is whether you're willing to help us catch the real mastermind. David stared at them both. What exactly are you asking me to do? We have reason to believe that someone will attempt to contact you in the coming weeks. The network has been monitoring your case closely, and they may try to recruit you as Margaret's replacement. The suggestion was so